Good evening, colleagues, and welcome to NCE Live. I'm welcomed this evening by Emma Kell and Clemmie Stewart. And in Nick's place this evening, I've got my wonderful colleague Binks Neat Evans to support me on the podcast. So I just would like to introduce Emma and Clemmie. So Emma and I worked together some moons ago in a very different guise when Emma was head of English and MFL at a very large secondary school in Tottenham. And I worked for the central team. So we got to know each other very well then and had lots of laughs and a few tears now and again, but mostly lots of laughs. And Clemmie was a learner on level 7 at the NCE before I joined. But they've come together and contributed on a new book, engaging parents and carers with school. So before we start to talk about that, Emmy, I wondered if you could just introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about you.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. I think we're a prime example of what a tiny world teaching is, because we could talk to anyone, I'm sure, on this call and discover we knew about 10 people in common. So yes, so my name's Emma Kell. I've been on this podcast before talking about wellbeing, which was a really lovely experience, actually, and people still occasionally mention that they've heard it. I've been teaching for almost 25 years. I've done various roles within schools, from fairly inept TA through to assistant head teacher in charge of teaching and learning. And I currently teach in a pupil referral unit, a very fabulous pupil referral unit in Watford. And I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. And I do remember one of the things that really kind of rang true with people was the idea of glass balls and rubber balls, I think, that you talked about in wellbeing, and knowing which ones you can drop and which ones you need to catch. That's always kind of resonated with me. Clemmie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Clemmie. I've been a teacher for 14 years, and similar to Emma, really worked my way all the way through, and ended up being a head teacher across 2 prep schools in London, but have worked cross sector. And I'm now working as the Director of Learning and Teaching for a trust of, as of today, 15 schools and nurseries, and also a partner school out in Saudi Arabia. So passionate about education and just delighted to be joining you. And as you rightly said, did NCE during the pandemic, actually, and listened to Emma's podcast on wellbeing. So it really is very cyclical. It's lovely to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us, particularly as Clemmie's only just kind of running the house from a very long day to visit a new school, and Emma is sat in her car as her daughter does goalkeeping practice. Did you say with the Premier League she's with, Emma?
She does. My plug for my daughter. Yes, she plays for the Junior Premier League, and it is -4 degrees. And she's just recovered from that horrible throat infection, and she insisted on coming to football, which is why I am not taking my scarf off, because it's freezing.
Well, thank you for your commitment to the cause. We really appreciate you both joining us this evening. So I wondered if you could start by just telling us a little bit about why you decided to write this book.
Sure. So, for us, we... Oh, God, Em.
Go on, Ken.
So we've, I suppose, increasingly felt that this is an area that has really needed addressing and has been desperately requested by loads and loads of educationalists across the piece, just feeling that relationship with home is so integral, and yet there isn't a huge amount out there about it. You know, we've read some fantastic books, but there aren't that many, and the research was also quite limited. And the more that we dug into it, the more we pulled the thread, the more evident it was that there is so much that needs to be done in terms of addressing the relationship between home and school. And then, of course, COVID happened, and parents and schools had to work in such a different way. And I think there were lots of lessons that could be learned from that, both positively, but also some of the negatives. And we wanted to capture that and build on it. And in fact, Emma's got some additional information on that around sort of the context that parents are now experiencing and why it's even more relevant now.
Yes, I mean, from my point of view, there was the theme of parents was coming up increasingly in my work on wellbeing, particularly school leader wellbeing, and particularly since the pandemic. And there are many overlaps between the work that I'm doing in the 2 areas. And what I would say, and I've said this unapologetically in almost every context, is that I don't think that as a society, or indeed as a world, we've even begun to feel the impact of the pandemic. And with the cost of living crisis on top of that, and so much uncertainty and a lack of leadership in our country, I just think it's shaken us to the core. So there's so much going on. And obviously, it doesn't just affect our parents, it affects our colleagues, it affects our children. But we just felt that actually not only was there so much going on that was really exacerbating some of the problems that were occurring between schools and parents, but also that there is a significant minority of trainees and new teachers were saying that they felt sufficiently trained to work with parents. I think it was 3%, wasn't it, Clem, when we asked, felt that their training courses had sufficiently prepared them to work effectively with parents. So we suddenly saw a massive gap there. And I mean, I haven't done the NPQH, but I still don't think that even up as high as the lofty heights of the NPQH, I don't think even that really addresses full on the kinds of issues with parents that schools are seeing at the moment.
Emma, thank you, and to you, Clemmie, for that sort of kind of oversight. Can you give us some sort of ideas, some of the key messages that you sort of talk about in your book that you think will sort of connect people into it quickly? Some of the sort of big messages.
Sure. I mean, for us, and I think this ties in brilliantly with the session that you were talking about previously, Binks, that you've just done, is around communication. And as obvious as that sounds, our research is showing us the communication's just not working in all schools, both for parents but also for staff. You know, they're really, really struggling. And simple things like not knowing to whom they can address their concerns and not having that named person for their child. Much easier in primary, because you tend to have that core person that's responsible for your little person. But by secondary, you know, it's this huge school, and who do we talk to? Some of the loudest voices we found in our research were parents of children with SEND, and they were the most polarised. So they were the ones who are most likely to either say, our school's incredible, the communication's amazing, or our school is dreadful and we're not getting any communication at all. Now, obviously that's perception, but for everybody, their perception is their reality. So having a named person is crucial. The other key one I would say before handing over to Emma is also around the formality of your conversation. So some of the frustrations that parents came to us with was not feeling recognized as a trusted partner in that relationship, and sometimes feeling patronized. Things like calling you, hello, this is Binks's mummy, rather than Ms. Neat Evans or Dr. Kell. And so a simple thing there would be just to talk to your parent at the beginning of the academic year. How would you like to be addressed? What's the easiest way to get hold of you? What works for you in terms of your busy life, and building that communication? So I think that's one of my biggest takeaways, is just quality of communication and being organised and proactive.
Yes, one of my biggest bugbears is being called Mrs. Kell, because Mrs. Kell is my mum, and it also, or indeed Mrs. Vadgama, because I didn't change my name when I got married, and I'm not precious about much actually, but as a parent, that little thing is enough to almost to pull my back up before the conversation's even begun. So some of the key themes that I wanted to highlight then were around. We work in this oddly hierarchical system. Schools are oddly hierarchical. I think I talked about it when I talked about well-being, and so is our society. And we get into this situation where there's almost a sense on both sides of dehumanizing the other. There are parents and there is the school, and we are opposite entities, and it's a struggle. And a lot of the language used on both sides, and we really looked into this, can be really negative. Yeah, even amongst school leaders, nightmare parents, toxic parents, even the phrase hard to reach parents. Well, who's hard to reach here? Is it the parents or the schools? So in terms of sort of just humanizing the process, if you have that named contact, then it's no longer the school calling. It's Kimberly in the office, and it could be anyone. It could be anyone the parent has built a relationship with. It could be Kimberly in the office. It could be Donna, the deputy head. It could be Mark in the pastoral team. It could be anyone, but somebody the parent has built a relationship with. And also just having a chance to perhaps have those little conversations with the parents to remind them that you're human as well. I might well be using this slot to be calling parents and say, well, I'm sitting in the car waiting for my child to play football. I'm a human being as well. There's a lack of time on both sides, and that needs to be respected too. with the cost of living crisis, an increasing number of our parents are having to take on extra jobs. Many of our parents already had several jobs. So when we're saying, oh my goodness, they never turn up at parents' evening, it might not be because they don't care. One of the things that I was just thinking about when I was preparing for this was, as a school leader, making sure you've got your support network. Because when you feel a bit dehumanized, when you meet parents who are in reptilian fight or flight mode, and they feel their child has been wronged, and perhaps understandably they're a bit shouty or a bit emotional, and they talk to you as if you're not really human, that can really hurt. When it doesn't matter what level you're at, whether you've been teaching for 20 years or 2 months, if someone says to you, you're letting my child down, when you are working every hour under the sun to do your best for their child, then that really hurts. So where's your support network? Is it a governor? Is it your line manager? Do you have a coach? Do you have someone you can let off some steam with? Because actually, we know already that teaching itself is deeply emotional, and interactions with parents are as well. And really, I mean, there's a confession at the heart of this book for me, which is that I had an interview for probably the most senior position I ever had, which was in charge of teaching and learning on senior leadership team. And I got the job, very proud to say. But after the interview, in my feedback, they said, you didn't even mention parents. And I think sometimes we almost just, we don't, why don't we think about it? Because it's scary, or because it seems almost like an add-on thing. And I really took that feedback to heart. And since then, I think I've always made sure I think about parents as much as I can, even though sometimes it's really hard.
Thank you. I want to pick up on that in a moment, actually, but I just wanted to go back to Clemmie, and you made reference to the way in which we address people, and the difference probably between primary and secondary. But I was wondering, and I don't know if this is just an assumption on my part because I'm secondary, that the relationships with parents are maybe easier or closer in primary, but then something gets lost in secondary. Is that something that you found? I wondered if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So when we it's worth saying, when we started to write this book, we put out surveys to parents, to school staff, and repeatedly shared it because we wanted to hear as many voices as possible. And we had a good representation of data, actually. So I think it became very, very clear that what we presumed as well was accurate, which is that generally speaking, in primary schools, parents feel very well connected to the school. Emma even shared the example as a mummy of when her little one was about to go into early years, having the dreaded home visit, and the kind of panic of what that might look like. And the fact that we do that, and we take that level of interest in that relationship and the home, and that continues beautifully into early years. And as they move through primary, you always have that person that you can talk to. The practitioner tends to be on the gate. You tend to see them at pick up and drop off, because rarely do you have little ones going home on their own, and it's a really strong relationship. And I think parents get lulled into thinking that it continues like that into secondary. I was head of a through school, so I had children up to 11, and I felt like I knew those parents inside out and back to front. But they went from being in a 2-form entry school with me to a 9-form entry school at senior, and they're suddenly going, well, we just get shut at the gate. They just stop us at the door. They don't let us bring in the hockey stick that they've forgotten. It was like, well, of course they won't. They're expected to be independent. So again, I think one bit of guidance that we would give, particularly leaders on this podcast, but in general, is prepare your parents for the transitions that happen as they move from key stage to key stage, and they need to know what's coming. And they need to know how to prepare. And I don't want to alienate the whole of the secondary world, because I know there are some people in schools doing brilliant work with transition and communication. But invariably, the independence of the children, the age of the children, it naturally does drop off a bit. So just be mindful in terms of preparing your year 5 and 6 parents that things are going to be a little bit different in year 7.
Yeah, and I think the transition is often focused on the child, isn't it? When year 7's coming up, it's focused upon the child and what they will expect, and coming to visit the school for a day and getting used to it. But no one really prepares parents. And that's a really interesting point you've made there about how leaders can support parents in that transition process.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely.
And again, I think that can be one of our positive takeouts from COVID. We worked much more closely with our parents during COVID, telling them what was happening, telling them of changes, and they've come to rely on that. And we've got to be mindful of not just pulling back that digital bridge and shutting the doors again. We've got to keep it open. Anyway, Em, you carry on.
Yeah, no, just two things occurred to me as you were talking, Clem. One was that, at the end of primary, we have these massive tearful celebrations and the church visits and the prom and the endless celebrations. And then suddenly we're in this kind of no man's land trying to negotiate the rules. And obviously it's true that they have to get that independence going and things. But actually, as a parent of secondary, when I think back to the most meaningful moments of contact I've had with my children's teachers, my teenagers' teachers, they have been the moments when a teacher has said your child was kind today or your child was brave today. Those data sheets don't always actually mean that much. Actually, it's still those moments when you get that reminder that your child's teacher, usually a key person, sees them as a whole human being, and that means an awful lot.
Emma, can I go back to something that you raised that I think is a really interesting point for senior leaders to consider, and it links in actually with what Clemmie was saying around communication and how we communicate where we're at in how we're managing what's going on in schools and the sort of support networks. And one of the things we always encourage senior leaders to do is to be able to identify networks. So what kind of ideas do you visit around creating networks for leaders in terms of getting that psychological support, I guess, for the hard times, for the challenging times, when you don't know the answer times, when you just want to cry times? What kind of thing do you touch on in that respect, Emma?
Well, it's not a coincidence that we're back in the realm of well-being, and I
Yeah.
ran a session recently with head teachers from Buckinghamshire on parental engagement, and actually very quickly realised that really all they needed to do was talk to one another. I could give some input, but actually me facilitating the chance to talk to one another. So let's go back to some of the basics on this. It is very, very, very lonely at the top. It is incredibly hard work at the top. That metaphor of glass balls and rubber balls. So just in case anyone missed that one and hasn't listened to every single NCE podcast, this was the whole idea that as teachers we're all juggling, but some of the balls are made of glass and some of the balls are made of rubber. And the idea around work-life balance is to let the rubber balls fall, or chuck them at someone else, or just let them fly past your face because they don't matter. Well, what's happened since the pandemic is that all the balls, it feels as if, are made of glass. So it is it's safeguarding, it's special needs, it's mental health, it's scarlet fever at the moment. Everything coming into schools at the moment feels as if it's a glass ball. So that those networks are profoundly needed. So how might they look? I've noticed increasingly that local authorities for maintained schools have been really stepping up, and I will give a shout out to Buckinghamshire. So Buckinghamshire's running a, and I'm sure others are as well, but this one I'm aware of, programme of support for new head teachers and new school leaders where they get together regularly. And if you are invited to anything like that as a school leader, a senior leader, or a head teacher, my advice is just go. I know it feels impossible to leave school when you've got 15 staff off sick and everyone's tired and everyone's stressed and you've had 6 people in tears on you the day before, but go. So whether it's to talk about parents and engaging parents or something else, go. Use your governors. I've recently become a governor, and we've just been working on the habitual and vexatious complaints policy for parents, and it's a great title, but it's true, isn't it, that sometimes just like in the classroom, an awful lot of our time as leaders is taken up with a tiny minority of parents. If you've got a policy in place that's been ratified by governors, you've got something you can follow. You don't have to let it eat you alive. So use your governors. I know several head teachers now who have a key governor who literally just checks in on them every now and again and says, how are you doing? How are you doing? Is there anything you want to raise? Not in a massively time-consuming way for the governor, but just so, the head doesn't feel as if they're on their own. And yes, and there are social networks, some people love them, some people hate them, some people take them with a massive pinch of salt, but there are some lovely, if you go on Facebook, Primary School Leaders is a wonderfully supportive site. It's one of those gems of Facebook. If you're not on there and you're a primary school leader, do join. And Twitter, you've got #SLT chat. So just that reminder that you're not alone, and that chance to pick up the phone and say, look, I'm dealing with this. this is utter, I said that child couldn't sit where he wanted to, and now the parents launched a complaint with Ofsted, and I don't know what to do with myself, and I can't stop thinking about it. How might you deal with this? Because there's always someone out there willing to help.
Rachel, can I direct a question to Clemmie? So in terms of I think that's that sort of dealing, it sort of triggered me a little bit there, talking about the vexatious parents policy, because I've been there and I've done that, and actually I guess that it would be interesting to explore both your ideas, starting with you, Clemmie, really around how equipped do you feel leaders are in understanding how their leadership behavior is communicating different messages to parents. So do you think that we're in a good place with training leaders in that respect? Because I think sometimes we talk about the technical sides of leadership, but do we have that sort of psychological awareness of what we are communicating? To Clemmie, sorry.
I don't think we do. I don't think we do, sadly. I don't think we do. And I think, having been ahead, I was utterly blessed to have a coach for my first 2 years of headship in the shape of Andy Buck, who is just amazing. And he taught me lots of really effective strategies about managing heads. In fact, so much so that when I first came ahead, I was only 29, and I had a parent who booked a half an hour meeting with me and used the whole time to tell me that I wasn't ready for headship. It was one of the worst half an hours of my life. And luckily I'm quite resilient and quite robust. And I said, well, look, I tell you what, let's book this in for 6 months' time, and I will show you why I believe the panel was right to appoint me. But that bravery and that steely core, probably belied somebody who was actually absolutely petrified and well out of their depth in that conversation. And I don't think we are, I think, alert enough to our leadership behaviours, how we portray ourselves as leaders. And I think we're all getting better at being authentic leaders who lead with integrity and are more open to showing vulnerability, which I think is really important. But I think it's about knowing when to show that vulnerability and when not to show that vulnerability. And I think sometimes with parents, when you're looking at that more vexatious spectrum, or a parent who's really, really challenging for whatever reason, that's not the time to show that vulnerability. Whereas a parent who comes into your office and shares a recent diagnosis that's really affected their family, and you find yourself feeling quite emotionally connected to that conversation, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine to show that. And I think it's just being mindful of which version to bring to each conversation. And when I was listening to Emma talking there about that support in senior leadership, what Andy gave me, one of the strategies that I found so helpful, is that structure to a difficult conversation, the NEFIART acronym. So I'm going to test my memory now. Name the issue, give an example, talk about your feelings around it, state why it's important, accept any responsibility you might have in how we've got to this point, give the person time to respond, and then set a target moving forwards. If I had a difficult conversation with a parent coming up, I would rehearse my NEFIART conversation with my deputy head. And so by the time that parent was sat in front of me, I felt confident. We'd stress tested how it could go, and I just felt much better bolstered to have that difficult conversation. So a massive takeout I'd be giving to all of your leaders and learners tonight is, do not feel afraid to be vulnerable with your SLT. Rehearse the conversation, because you will go in 10 times more able to do it.
Thank you, Clemmie. I think that's something we kind of practice quite a lot about the NCE and advise around having a buddy or a peer or a mentor or a coach to do that practice. So that you do feel more prepared in that conversation, and also that helps you to contain your emotions, I think, as well, if that's the appropriate thing to do. And you've also kind of done a bit of a pre-mortem, haven't you? What could be the response to this, because it's quite an emotive subject. And I think headship has changed such a lot in terms of the demands and the emotional demands upon heads now. And I just wondered, Emma, if when you were doing this research, whether that was reflected in terms of what the job means now to be a senior leader in an organisation, or a teacher, when you're having to deal with such highly emotive situations and the emotional toll that can take on you. I was talking to one of our senior leaders, and she told me a story about a child being hungry, and it made us both cry. Because it was such, I was just thinking, that's such a lot to deal with on top of everything else, on top of just the mechanics of running a school, that emotional toil. So I just wondered if that had become apparent, or when you were looking at how to deal with parents.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge, and I've got to be very careful to anonymize any examples. But I work quite closely. I work as a coach as well. So I coach,
Yeah.
or have coached around 30 senior leaders and head teachers. And I was speaking to one a few weeks ago, and she'd been in a meeting with a parent and her son, and the son had moved from talking about suicidal ideation to actually actively telling the parent and her as a senior leader how, when, and where he was going to take his
Oh,
own
goodness.
life. And then she had a call a few days later, on a Sunday, in fact, from the head teacher saying, we need to have an extraordinary SLT meeting. And all she could think, she was so tired, so exhausted, so much going on, was this child has died and it's my fault because I could have done more. The child hadn't died, that it was a very serious issue that had happened in the school that he needed to, but her brain, between 5 in the evening and arriving at school at about 6:30, I think it was, because she's working crazy hours the next morning, was full up with it. And so yeah, these things really, and this is my chance actually to plug, if you are a DSL dealing with issues like this, and another woman told me she had to view child pornography, she as the DSL, she had to view these explicit videos of children in order to report them. Obviously no one else does, but she had to as the DSL. She, get supervision, for goodness sake. The proportion of DSLs who are not receiving supervision of any kind in my non-quantitative, not a quantitative survey, but in my experience, is ridiculous. If you are dealing with life or death situations of the safety and mental health of children, you need to have somewhere where you're letting off steam, because yes, I mean, I am hearing some of the most alarming stories of the mental health of school leaders being really, really badly hit at the moment. And I'm actually, I mean, on a broader note, if you look at the Education Support Wellbeing Index, which was published very recently, I think a couple of weeks ago, published every year, the mental health of people in education, senior leaders are once again by far the most vulnerable. And in fact, their mental health issues have spiked since last year. And I don't think that's just down to parents, but I think they're carrying an awful lot of the world on their shoulders at the moment.
I think it's a really interesting point. And one of the things I think that when we're reflecting on parents and our how we're managing the challenges that they're managing, I always sort of try and remind people, either that I've coached or that are learners, is that actually we mustn't forget that what is happening in society will also be happening in your staff room, because the
Yes.
sorts of issues that your community are facing, quite often our staff are drawn from the community, aren't they? So they will be experiencing similar things to members of your community. So you've kind of got that sort of double bind with as a leader, haven't you, of go on, Emma, sorry, I'll stop.
No, and I'm responding to what you said. Yes, but you cannot be there for everybody else all of the time and leave nothing left for yourself. And it's so easy to get sucked in to that spiral of almost literally carrying the world on your shoulders. I am a school leader in the center of a community which is suffering. I have to shoulder everything, and it's so hard. It's particularly if you've got DSL responsibilities or any kind of safeguarding or pastoral role. It's so hard to draw those boundaries when you know there are hungry children, and you know there are suicidal children. But I'm moving into my other specialist area now, I know. But you have to be well in order to make positive change for other people, including parents. And I am very passionate about that, as you can tell.
Which is fantastic to hear, and it's great to have your expertise and Clemmie's. In my just getting engrossed in this conversation, as I always do, and forgotten to mention to those in our audience, if you would like to pose a question to Clemmie and Emma, then please do. Obviously, if it's about a situation, just make it anonymous if you're wanting some advice and guidance. So what I'm kind of hearing so far about how some of the kind of techniques that we can use to help as leaders in organisations around working with our stakeholders. So I was listening to something on the radio about being selfish in a really positive way, and that was about protecting yourself and making sure you did have some kind of gas in the tank still to be able to deal with situations. So this idea of supervision, particularly for those dealing with day in day out, our DSLs, etc., getting a coach or a mentor or a peer or a buddy who you can share some of this experience with and probably gain expertise from others who've been in similar situations. Planning around conversations that might be difficult that you've had, which builds your stamina and expertise and resilience. Um, what else did you find in terms of developing these relationships? So we've talked a little bit about kind of the negative aspects, but the more positive aspects of really kind of building those relationships. Clemmie, I'm going to come to you first to maybe talk a little bit about those positive relationships with our stakeholders.
Sure. So we were invited to do a session with the education roundtables, a roundtable with head teachers back in Birmingham a while back, and we ended up pulling together some what we called our countdown, which is basically our sort of top tips for getting this right. And my first one just says start with why, and I'm not embarrassed to admit I've got Simon Sinek on my desk. It's one of my leadership Bibles, and just being really clear in terms of communicating with families as they come into your community. What's your why as a school in your community? Why are you there? Because it always comes back to the children, and that's what parents want to hear too. And that starting point just puts you on an absolute level playing field of you're here for the children, I'm here for the children, this is what we seek to do as a school, and this is why we need you on board with us to do this positively together. Then embed that as a member of the community and explore different ways in terms of how you do that, whether it's being on the gate. One thing I did as a head, and again I would really strongly recommend this to any of your senior leaders, was I used to invite the parent reps and the PTA into my school once a half term, where they could throw any question at me, any complaint, any celebration. And if it was raised by more than one parent, I would address it publicly with all of them. And it just put an end to, on behalf of everybody, or the WhatsApp groups alive, but it just stopped all of that because we were having the face-to-face conversation. If I could make positive change based on their feedback, I would. If I couldn't, I would articulate why and what the reasons were behind it and how that linked back to our why. So there was just crystal clear communication all the way through. We also talk about the need to be precise in your feedback, so succinct and precise. So, you know, again, parents can see through that kind of positive sandwich of, well, she's had a really good day at school, but she did do this, but, you know, tomorrow's a fresh day. They can see through that. They just want to know precise, succinct feedback. Good stuff as well as the bad is really, really important. That importance around communication that we've talked about, and I just scribbled next to it, seek first to understand. And we explore a lot within one of the chapters the need to bring an empathetic understanding to the parents' experience of school. One of the very few things that we all have in common, wherever we went to school, whatever that experience was like, was that at some point we were in school. Perhaps not all the way through, but at some point we have all been to school, and we bring with us a huge amount of emotional baggage and understanding to that. Some of us, like me, very lucky to be able to say I loved school, I loved that experience. Others hated it. And in fact, my little brother, who's now a father, hated school, and he's already getting stressed about his little one going to school, and his little one is 1. So it does carry that huge emotional burden. So just being mindful of that. Being proactive, getting ahead of things, catching them early, I think is crucial as well. Embracing technology, we put as well. Again, you know, we made such strides with technology in terms of things like Tapestry down in the early years, or using social media, or having video calls for those parents who simply cannot get to parents' evening at 3:30. Let's keep that open. That's been a real success story. Let's keep that going. And then finally was just keeping it simple and just going back to your values, back to your moral compass, and keeping reflecting on the quality of the communication in your school. One of the questions we posed to some heads at an event recently was, how effective is your communication in school, and how do you know? Because I know I would have gone, yeah, really good, we're really good, we do workshops and we do online things, but actually if you then dug under, is that hitting all your parents? Is it actually having impact? Is it improving those relationships? And if you do that deep level of reflection, you're more likely to come up with a more effective strategy. So I think those are kind of our top 10, is that top 8?
I'm going to let Binks come in with a question, but I just wanted to amplify what you said there about how do you know? And I think you could apply that to all school leadership, is, you know, our curriculum is really successful? How do you know? Our children are really happy. How
How
do
do
you
you
know?
know?
And that key, really, that simplicity of how do you know is almost, I think, school leaders should have that
Yeah.
on a sticky in front of their laptop as a guide
Yeah.
all the time to just bring it back to that. But I'm going to hand over to Binks
Yeah,
now
and
because I think she's got a
sort of
question.
building on really what you were saying, Clemmy, in getting that feedback um, from your parents as stakeholders. So really, to you, Emma, in terms of when you get that feedback, what have you got suggestions that are useful for leaders in terms of there's kind of harder to reach parents and different ways that we can connect up with parents? Because I think there's this notion that they must always come to us, like like Clemmy says, everyone's been to school and it's part of our culture, isn't it? You've been to school, but actually for some people that's it's such a difficult place for them to revisit. Have you got suggestions that you can give to leaders about different ways of engaging with the sort of harder, well, I don't like saying harder to reach, but people that would prefer to be communicated with in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest and say that was the hardest chapter to write. It was the
Right.
one about inclusivity. So
Yeah.
I had put out a tweet actually saying how do schools reach hard to reach parents, and I was called up on it on that language and
Yeah.
and called up, and quite rightly called up on it, because actually are the parents hard to reach, or are the
Yeah.
schools hard to reach? Is there someone in the school which speaks the language? That phrase keeps coming back to me. You cannot be what you cannot see. So as parents are walking around the school, do they see themselves represented in the displays, in the staff in the school, in the cultures and religions represented across the school? And if they don't, why don't they? Because we know that in most schools, many schools outside London, I think London was an exception, the majority of staff are white and middle class. I think that, and depending on whether it's primary or secondary, primary, majority are also female. Also just understanding that if we bring parents into a classroom or into a school hall, we wrote about this here, the mere smell of the hall, the smell of a school can send parents right back into panic. So thinking carefully about those setups, let's not make them sit in little tiny uncomfortable chairs, because that actually makes them feel small again, and particularly if we're towering over them in a bigger chair. So really just maybe one of the suggestions that came back and was to do sort of invite parents in to do walks around the school. Just come for a walk around our school and let us know what you see, and let us know what you hear. But I just wanted to come in off the back of the suggestion for more positive things, if that's okay, because I just, as Clemmy was talking, I was scribbling away with a few more, if that's all right. And one is linked to that actually. It's linked to something Clemmy said, which is the whole idea of social media. So that just the words social media will strike cold into the hearts of many people on this call, I'm sure. I recently saw a thread on social media, a local group of parents saying, please share your complaints about this school because we're organising a public meeting. The school wasn't involved in this. It was out there on Facebook. And I just thought, oh my goodness, that poor leadership team. It was out of their control completely. There's something a head I spoke to does, which I thought was wonderful, which is, it sounds sneaky, but it's not really. He's got a mole on all of the Facebook groups.
Yeah.
So year 7, year 8, year 9, he's just got a little mole on there. And it's not the same mole, I don't think. He's got different moles. I suspect I may be a mole in another context, and people let him know. So he will simply address the issues in the newsletter. So no, you don't have to print out the whole history booklet. You can work online. That's absolutely fine. I gather there was a concern about that. Yeah, I know it's getting cold. But there will be, we will take that into account by letting students wear their coats in classrooms. Whatever it is, just nipping those things in the bud, and at the same time saying, I'm watching you, which I thought was quite nice. And just the other thing I wanted to say is just kind of remembering that the vast majority of parents, and I'm speaking as a parent now, are so grateful for everything you do. The vast majority, and I'll say that again, the vast majority of parents are so grateful for everything you do. Not just, there are loads of silly videos online about parents who had to homeschool and how grateful they were and how in awe they were, but I don't really mean that. I mean the small things, and it always does come back to the small things. That moment when I don't know, a feisty female teacher instilled feminist values in my daughter and taught her not to be a complete wet blanket in a certain situation, and has had a lifelong impact on her, I suspect. That teacher who has such high standards that my daughter will say, I haven't got any homework, and she'll go, oh no, it's Miss Butt. There we go, give her a name check. Oh no, it's Miss Butt. And then she'll scurry upstairs to get her homework done because Miss Butt has really high standards. And those things that we're so grateful for. And I'm wondering about establishing practical lines of communication where you actually invite parents to shout out, provide a forum, provide an email address, provide us an area on the website specifically for positive shout outs to staff, because we so need a boost at the moment as a profession, don't we? So I realise
I think that's a lovely thing to do, Emma. And as a parent, whenever a teacher emails me to tell me something about my daughter, I always email back and say thank you for taking the time to do that, because I know that's another thing on their list that they've had to do. And I think it's really important that we see ourselves, if we are in those dual roles, and model some of that behaviour. I wanted to pick up on Clemmie's point about empathy. And maybe link with environment, because I think there's often a temptation to kind of take a parent into the head's office. So when I was a vice principal, I think the receptionist would always call me with an angry parent, because I was fairly good at just being calm and kind, I think. So I would always put them in a little room of reception with a nice comfy seat and make them a cup of tea and just say, tell me what's wrong. What can I do to help? Not, go straight into what their child had done, and just diffusing that situation and showing some empathy for their emotions and how they're feeling about their child, who is one of the most important things in their life, and not going, well, we'll go up to the head's office and I'll sit behind my powerful, impressive desk and you can sit on the low chair. I think, coming to people as equals and just being able to show some empathy can often take the sting out of that immediacy of people being angry because they've come up to school because their child's phone has been taken away, which might be completely legitimate, but there's something behind that has made them really angry around that. And that was kind of a lesson I had learned from a more experienced colleague, which really held me in good stead, and I was able to practice some of those behaviours. So I just wondered around that, if that is a point around environment and empathy, Clemmie.
Yeah, I definitely think it is. And again, I keep harking back to COVID, for which I apologise. But, when we couldn't have parents on site, if I needed to talk to a parent really badly, we'd meet at my school gate and we'd walk in a loop down to the Thames, along a little bit, back up to school. And it was about a 20-minute walk. And it was comfortable because we weren't face to face. We were walking side by side. We were just kind of talking stuff through. There was no one there note taking or anything else. And obviously, if it's a really difficult or important meeting, I'm not suggesting you go off walking on your own with an angry parent, of course I'm not, but where it's appropriate, just being outside, going for a walk, even just walking around the playground, someone knows where you are, it just removes the whole formality of, oh no, I'm going to get dragged into the head's office. And it made a huge difference for sure, for me, I think. And it's also working out with parents, I need to talk to you, does a phone call work for you, would you like a Teams meeting, what works for you? Because ultimately, I'm going to be at school from 7 till 7, so let's make this work for you, I think was really, really crucial. And I also, teachers are very, very good at picking up the phone, normally on a Friday afternoon, and choosing 2 or 3 children to big up and shout out. I tried to do that as a head as well. So when I had been into a lesson or I'd heard a child do something brilliantly in assembly, I tried to find the time to pick up the phone to a parent or drop them an email and just say, do you know, that child shone today. It was just amazing. So proud of them. Thought you would be too. Never more than 1 or 2 sentences, because there are over 300 children. And I also kept a register in the back of my diary to make sure I'd done everyone by the end of the year. So that it just meant that if I did then have to have that difficult conversation, we'd had the good times too. And therefore it was like, come on, it's not always bad. And that, again, Em and I were talking in preparation for this, it feels like building those relationships with parents takes time, and it does take a bit of time. But the time you get back, if you do it right, will save you days and days, because you can just have that more succinct, more proactive, positive communication. So invest the time at the start and you will reap the rewards.
I think Emma's got a hand up there, like a really good
Yeah,
girl in class.
just to emphasize that theme around empathy, that came back again and again and again when we interviewed heads about this. Was, you know, if it's a regular parent, memorize how they take their tea or coffee. Say, right, come on, and being shouted at is horrible. Having someone raise their voice to you is horrible, especially when you are absolutely shattered. But we are naturally fixers, aren't we? We're naturally fixers as teachers. It's something in us that wants to just sort it out and tick it off and say, right, that's sorted. But actually, something I've really learned as a coach is sometimes human beings just want to be heard. They just want to be listened to. And if the air goes blue in the process, then so be it. But actually, you'll often find that just giving the parent, I know it's time and I know time is scarce, but giving the parent 10 minutes, 20 minutes just to vent and then take a deep breath, you'll often find that actually 90% of the problem, not always, but a lot of the time, that actually for that parent to have been heard in a safe space and to have been able to get it out of their system will have made them feel a lot better, and they'll be grateful to you just for that, and that will help build the relationship.
Absolutely. And I'm going to bring Binks in a moment, but one of the things I kind of passed on to new members of SLT was, if you have time and a parent needs you and they're here, go see them. Don't say they have to make an appointment. They're there now. You will solve that problem quickly and you will develop that relationship. Don't put on formalities. You're not that important. The child is the most important thing. So if you've got the time, and if it's a parent who's very distressed, call one of us to come and just stand in your class for 5 minutes if that's what you need to do, because that will diffuse something so quickly. And the positive phone call, Clemmy, is just one of the easiest things I think to do. There is nothing nicer for a parent, particularly if their children struggles at school in whichever way it is, to hear something nice about their child on a Friday, which is, I really enjoyed teaching him today and he answered a question for me. Simple as that. The amount of parents I've had say it's such a nice thing to get a call from the school which isn't about their poor behaviour. And that level of empathy, of feeling, what it feels like to be a parent who only ever gets bad phone calls. You have it within your gift to ring and say something nice. Binks, I'm going to bring you in with your question. Sorry,
Rachel. Actually, it's really interesting because I think what that does as well, when we were talking, we've talked about both sides of sort of parental engagement when things are tricky and when things are going well. I think what that does is you're putting deposits in the bank of goodwill, because we know that things are not always going to be easy, but if you've built up that sort of that bank and those credits, actually you can draw on that, can't you, in hard times. And I just wanted to, as you were both talking about your sort of relationship, how you develop those relationships, I was just kind of thinking about an experience I had when I took over one of my previous headships. And one of the things that I had to really check in myself was and Emma, you've alluded to it, the sort of white middle class values of my, how I spend my time and what is worthy, what these children should be doing. And actually I had to kind of leave my Holcomb tartan blanket and raw carrot and hummus values and really kind of check my values. And was I projecting them onto my community? And I think that I'll just be interested of either of you to comment on how leaders can go through that process of checking their own values and how much that is altering the way they are managing situations. I'm just curious as to what you think about that.
Sure. I think that's a fantastic question, Binks. And my first leadership experience was in a school in Aldershot. It was a school that was in special measures when I joined it. I joined as a year 5 teacher, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and very little idea of what was going on, having gone through independent school all the way through myself, and my first school having been a class teacher of 12 children in a prep school. I suddenly rocked up at this 30-strong school in special measures, knowing full well that's what I wanted to do, but blissfully unaware of what I was going into. And it was in the middle of an army garrison in Aldershot. It was between 2010 and 2014 when all of the parents were on active service. And up rocks Clementine going, oh, hello everybody, it's so nice to see you. And just suddenly thinking, my God, you are so far out of your comfort zone here. And just going back to that thing of seeking first to understand. And parents' evening it was a really difficult situation there, because most of the parents were in Afghanistan. For some of these children, they'd moved so much that by the time they were in year 5 with me, they were on their 7th or 8th primary school. Therefore, a lot of the parents didn't really build links, because what's the point? They'll be moving up to Catterick in a few weeks' time. And the way that I learned how to manage that was to just get to understand the parent situation first. So in a parents' evening, just starting off with going, how are things for you at home at the moment? What's that looking like? You know, how often are you getting to speak to him out there? Or again, making assumptions. But for Fijian families, often the mum that was away and the dad that was looking after the children. And just trying to understand their experience of school, and then leaving mine at the door, not making apologies for who I was or the experiences I'd had, but suspending that to focus entirely on the parent in front of me. And being brave enough to challenge when certain assumptions or comments were made that shocked me. I mean, I had one dad who, and this is no word of a lie, said, please stop teaching my son to read. I've told him it's gay. I'm not having him doing it anymore. And he literally just said it like that. And I thought, my God, how do I respond to that? And it was just, rather than flipping out, which is what I wanted to do, and go, that's ridiculous, you can't say that, going, okay, why do you think that? Where's that come from? What are your concerns? And just addressing concerns one by one, and just building such a powerful relationship with parents. And going back to another point you made about learning from the community, because so many of the colleagues I was working with were forces mums or forces wives, and just trying to understand the context from their point of view, so I didn't go and put my foot in it, which I'm renowned for doing. And I think the experience of doing that for 4 years has set me up in such good stead to then be a head, be a senior head, be a governor. It's just that suspending your own stuff and focusing entirely on the person in front of you, I think, is just critical.
That is such great advice, and as a former forces wife, Clemmie, I think I would have really enjoyed you being a teacher of one of my children. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Alex has asked if you could go through the acronym again, Clemmie, maybe a little bit slower, so people
Alex, come on.
write it down. Quick, Alex, get your pen.
Gee, funnily enough, get your pen. I've not actually, do you know, I promise this isn't set up. I was using my laptop on a pile of books, and the book that it comes from originally is this one, which is Susan Scott's Fierce Conversations. And I think Andy's taken that and worked with this acronym. So let's go. It's NEFI art. So N is name what you're there to talk about. E is give an example. F is your feelings around it. I is why it's important. A is accept any responsibility you might have had in getting to this point. R is giving them time to respond, and T is setting a target. So let me give you an example. An example I shared at a conference recently was a parent who, in between September to January, had sent me and my team 798 emails and expected a response to every single one. And she was a fee-paying parent. She felt that was her right, and it was just eating up so much time. So I called her in and I said, I need to talk to you about the amount of communication we're receiving from you at the moment. For example, in just the last 3 months alone, I've received 798 emails from you. I feel quite frustrated by that, because it's taking up quite a lot of my staff's time and it's causing a few issues. And yet I know it comes from a really good place, because you want to work in partnership, and it's really important that we continue to build on that partnership together. I accept I probably should have got in touch with you about this a little bit sooner, but hey, we're here, we're now. What are your thoughts? Why are you having to engage so much? Done. The whole thing's done in 30 seconds. And then we set a target moving forward to stop that from being an issue. You can literally apply that acronym to anything. So thank you to Andy Buck, and thank you to Susan Scott. And there's a worked example.
Thank you so much, Clemmie. That was absolutely brilliant. Andy was on our first podcast, actually. We worked very closely with him, so he's a big friend of ours. We love Andy.
Love him.
Emma, I wanted to ask you a question from Emily, who asks, how do you deal with a parent who genuinely believes that the teacher is the problem and not the
This
child?
is a really tricky one, and I may well defer to Clemmie in a minute, but I'm going to make a couple of points. So this is quite common at the moment, particularly, I think, with so many parents feeling very vulnerable and feeling that their children are very vulnerable and feeling scared for their children and so on. So this one is quite common at the moment. I would say that in this situation, well, firstly, yes, go through all of the seek to understand, plan your conversation, use NEFI art, do all of those things first, absolutely. One piece of advice from a head teacher recently who had a complaint escalate to the most serious levels. She said, I wished I'd chosen my battles early on. So if what the parent wants is something that isn't entirely unreasonable, like for their child to move seats or wear a different pair of socks to the ones in the school policy, then consider choosing your battles. That advice came from an experienced head who said, if it's a particular issue like that, if the parent persists, then I think it comes back to your policies, your procedures, going back to your curriculum, what's on the website, your school values, what you've promised to deliver, and you assuring that parent that you will deliver that, and you as the school leader or the head teacher, you will run your school. So you have to be loyal to your member of staff. I would say you absolutely, I mean, you know this, you're all school leaders, but that is, you know, you could sometimes, because there will be situations when the teacher maybe is the problem, but you have to be loyal to your member of school staff. So those are my first thoughts. I think Pinks has some thoughts, and Clemmie probably does as well.
No, I mean, I just remember it all very, very clearly, Emma, and just making that judgment about, you know, how you manage those individual, and I think it's important what you communicate to your staff when you do that, Emma. I think that's really important. But Clemmie, I think we'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I mean, what I was scribbling down as you were talking, Em, is what I would always seek to do is talk about the behaviour, not the child. So again, it's very quick to say, oh, he was really naughty, or he was really frustrating because he did this. Well, actually, just describe the behaviour. What exactly did you see? And I think it's about saying, well, I'll tell you what, let me go and watch a lesson. Let me go and see what's happening, and be clear to be going in with an open mindset first, rather than instantly defending. Just, I'll go have a look. I hear what you say. I can't give you an answer right now. Let me go and see. And then feeding back with really clear examples, a bit like how you would if you were feeding back to somebody like a learning walk that you've been on, with really succinct examples, and try and get a broad holistic picture of that child as well. So if you're asking that question as a senior leader, rather than, I was about to say just the teacher, I don't mean it like that, but rather than just a teacher that's receiving a complaint, but as a senior leader about a teacher, go and see them in different lessons, so that you could then say, you know, it's really interesting, after you posed that issue, I went to go and watch her in PE, and actually she was really engaged, and there was something there that I think we can tap into as a success. And but equally, I saw very similar behaviour in music where she's clearly not enjoying that, and we need to unpick that too. So giving a really broad picture of their child. And the only other thing I'd say is, I used to start every conversation with, well, tell me about the child you see at home, because often they would start to let things slip, and you'd be like, oh, so she's not going to bed until 11 o'clock at night. Okay, that's really interesting. And you start to get a broader picture, and you're showing the parent that you're valuing their input, you're valuing their experience, you're recognizing them as the person who sees the child for 18 hours a day rather than the 6 hours that we see. And you're starting to build that kind of collaborative, we're in this together, let's share what we're seeing, and see how we can build forward.
Rachel, can I just add one little bit to that, in terms of, and it requires skill and good judgment, but also the way in which you talk to the child about what is happening, because sometimes we do have children that do stitch their teachers up. And actually, if you know, you can get that kind of toxic triangle between the child, the parent, and home. And actually having, you know, what we don't want to do is, you don't want to be making children feel really uncomfortable in adult conversations. I don't think that's ethical. But actually sometimes talking with the child in an appropriate way about, let's talk to your mum about what you think happened, and actually sometimes children can really help resolve those issues, because they'll soon, they don't want to really upset either party, do they? Quite often I think they can be put in I wouldn't want to put them in a difficult position, but they can actually help if it's done skillfully.
Thank you, Binks, and thank
I think
you
that's
to
really, really good advice.
Go, Clemmie, go.
One thing I was just going to add as well is, we talk to the parents too about being mindful of the communications they have at home about the school, because anyone who's worked with little people, as we all have, these work really, really well, and it's amazing what they can pick up. So it's just about everybody, every corner, being mindful of how they communicate about each stakeholder is so important.
Absolutely, and I think that really kind of is a nice kind of holistic comeback to communication and the power of language. And you've just so articulately expressed that about being deliberate in our language and really thinking through those communications, because it does so much to address a situation in a positive manner. I just wondered if you could both end, perhaps Emma first and then Clemmie, with the kind of one real kind of word of wisdom or that you would like to communicate to school leaders at the moment around those parent and carer relationships?
I'm just going to go back to remember the vast majority of parents and carers are really, really grateful for and appreciative of the work you do, and create opportunities for them to tell you so, because you need to hear it at the moment. It's tough out there.
And I think I would add, as school leaders, you are so strategic in every other aspect of what you do. You're strategic with the curriculum, you're strategic with assessment, you're strategic with safeguarding. And then this whole parent piece kind of trundles along a little bit awkwardly at the bottom. Be as strategic, set your goals, set your vision for what it's going to look like, plan how that's going to look over the year, and repeatedly reflect on how it's going and how do you know, and give it the same effort and the same passion that you do all other aspects of school leadership, because I promise you'll reap the benefits. You really, really will do.
Thank you so much. Binks, thank you for joining me as co-host this evening.
It's been a pleasure.
Emma and Clemmie, come back soon, please. That was absolutely wonderful. There's so much more to talk about. And really just such great words of wisdom for our learners at the NCE. So thank you for your time this evening. Have a wonderful Christmas. I think I'm going to start saying that now.
Thank
and
you
hope
so
to speak
much.
to you soon.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Amazing.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Nice. Lovely to see you.